So to begin with, would you like to tell me about the project and how you got your ideas to undertake the research?
Well, the idea for the whole area, which is looking at gender and entrepreneurship, came out of the work that I'd done previously, because I used to work in an organisation that supported women into business. And then I came into working in HE and started thinking about how entrepreneurship is approached in an education setting, and then thinking about the sorts of people who graduate from university and go on to start up businesses, and it is primarily men. Mm-hmm. So I became interested in, well, what's going on there, what's happening, and when I tried to read up about it, there was nothing really that looked at institutional factors or staff influences on the curriculum and how students in different courses might respond to entrepreneurship, rather than just students in business schools, because I was aware when I was working that there was a push to get entrepreneurship and enterprise and business startup out of business schools and into all of the curriculum throughout the whole of the university campus. So that's pushing it out into health, mm-hmm. into the arts, engineering, and I was just interested in how that was working, because it seemed like there was a real push from the government policy, but it was more about universities reacting and not. It didn't really seem thought out, or I don't know. It just seemed like there was a lot going on, but it wasn't really underpinned by any research or anybody actually following what was going on. So that sort of came out through that, and I started on a part-time EdD when I was working, and so I'd done a taught first year, so I'd sort of gone through that, and then I got the opportunity to have a fully funded PhD. What happened was, the course that I did, the EdD, they were very clear about the underpinning, the theoretical underpinning, and how can you know how you're going to approach things, or the sort of area you want to look at, or the way you want to interact with the data, or the sort of data that you're going to be working with, unless you have from the beginning an understanding of how you could do it, the different research methods, the different methodologies, quantitative, sort of qualitative, those sort of what you can use. So the starting point for me, thinking about the research, was a theoretical starting point. So I did a lot of reading around education, and I originally looked at Foucault because of it sort of suggested you might go and have a look at this, because I was interested in looking at discourses and ideas and how they influence people and how they sort of come through in policy and those sort of things. And through that, I came across Bourdieu, who I'd never heard of. I do know now that he's very well known in education research, but I felt like I'd discovered this person. I was really excited because I could really see how the theory actually had practical and understandable applications, and how you could actually explain the theory but in quite easy to understand terms, and it sort of made sense to me, and I could see how I could sort of see how I could sort of look a bit more about what was going on, because it's not dualistic. It's not about objectivity or subjectivity. It's not about the external and the internal. It's about his ideas are more. It's about negotiating, how we as individuals negotiate our relationship with the external world, and likewise how we're affected. So it's a way of looking at the social world that isn't either or, it's both and. So I quite like that. It makes it more complex and more complicated, but ultimately it just looked really interesting, just like a really interesting way of approaching the research and the practicalities of the research. So that's sort of where it came from. That's sort of to make a short story long.
So can you just embellish on the Bourdieu then? Yeah,
I mean Bourdieu, he's a French sociologist. He came from a lot of used a lot of different methods. He used quantitative methods. He used qualitative methods. He was always very suspicious of the separation of the quantitative and the qualitative, and he sort of thought that was a false way of looking at things, and obviously because he was, and he didn't like dualism. He liked things, sort of the interaction of things, and so that was quite interesting. And he started off as an ethnographer and working with groups in Algeria, and a lot of his sort of ideas about societies and culture came from that, and working with these different groups of people. And then he came back to France and he took that ethnographic approach and took it into looking at society in France. And then he started to look at education. He got into looking at higher education and looking at how different forms of what he calls capital. And we sort of there's the idea about human capital. And he broke that down into economic capital, cultural capital, social capital, and symbolic capital. And economic capital is obviously the money and resources you can draw upon, whether that's through family connections or through a job that you do or an inheritance or whatever. And then there's social capital, which is to do with the networks that you're embedded in, and they may be family networks, they may be work networks. They may be community networks, and then there's cultural capital, which is linked very much to education, but also to the sort of aspects around taste and exposure to maybe the arts or the sort of literature that you might read, and how that sort of gives you a sense of yourself and your class. He was very much into sort of ideas around class as well, which is where habitus comes in, because he talks, his theory of practice looks at the interplay of habitus, capital and field. And capital are all these resources that we can draw on, and they're also resources that we can, in different environments, we can enhance, or we can transfer capital. So, for example, if we can transfer the cultural capital of having a degree for the economic capital of getting a more highly paid job because of our degree. So it's about the transferability. And I was kind of interested in the other form of capital, which is symbolic capital. Mm-hmm. And because I was looking at gender, I was interested in looking at gender capital and how masculine or feminine ideas might have certain links with entrepreneurship, and therefore maybe men might find it easier to draw on the symbolic capital to exchange it for the economic capital of entrepreneurship or getting a high status job. So it sort of, for me, it gave me hooks to hang ideas on as well. And his theories have been called sort of thinking tools, way of just helping you to sort of think differently about things. And with habitus, that's the socially produced self, and that's to do with feelings about sort of things about class, and it's not just an internal thing. It's also, there's the sense that as working class, society has an idea of what a working class person would be like, what a working class woman would be like, what a working class man would be like, and likewise middle class. So it's not only about how you see yourself as middle class, or how you might look like you're middle class, but you might suggest that you're working class. It's really about how to capture the complexity of people's lives and the complexity of their interactions in different environments, which is where field comes in, because he talks about moving in different fields, and he sees different, like education is a field. It has certain rules that people play by, it has certain ways of getting into it, it has certain capital that's valued, it has certain capital that's not valued. People go in to enhance their cultural capital, and so I was looking at the field of education, but I was also looking at how the wider field of business and entrepreneurship was sort of filtered through that field, and then looking at how the students that I interviewed and the staff that I interviewed, what their conceptions were of the sort of, if you like, the background and class and resources and things that people need to be like in order to be an entrepreneur, and how that sort of played out as far as the habitus, capital and field.
So the title of your thesis was?
Well, it's called The Gendering of Entrepreneurship in Higher Education, a Bourdieuian Approach.